So the first talk of today's session is a keynote given by Professor Peter Talling at Durham University, who's going to show some of the work his team has done recently on monitoring of sediment transport processes in turbidity currents down the Congo Canyon and Congo submarine channel. Cassie, Pete, if you are there, go ahead and take it away.
Cool, thanks Joris. So if people can hear me, I'll just share the screen and start on this. Hopefully it'll be an introduction to the next two talks as well. And thanks to everybody for putting together this virtual presentation and series of talks, but also as a kind of aperitif for the in-person event next year. So it's really appreciated. It's quite an inspiring kind of group of people. So if people can see the slides, I'll introduce a project which measured the longest sediment flow of any type, actually, measured on Earth, or indeed in action on any planet, which went for 1,000 kilometers.
Peter, we can see the slides, but not in presentation mode. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay. So you can see the PowerPoint one now?
Yes, with the title slide.
Brilliant. So thanks for bearing with us. It's coming from a small apartment in Corsica, so hopefully everything will hang together. So it's the story of a very long sediment flow, 1,000 kilometers into the deep sea. Some of this is already published at the white paper there, and involves a very large group of people, which I can't really have time to thank everybody, but it's a very big team effort. It's really an introduction for the even more exciting talks, I think, which come after this. So if you look, kind of zoom out, there may be 4 different ways of looking at turbidity currents. I used to be an outcrop geologist, spent many years, which I really enjoyed being on the outcrops, but I was always frustrated because I couldn't quite tell which of the models that people were proposing were correct. If there were 5 geologists and 5 different models for the outcrop, I couldn't tell which one was correct. Some flows, different types of flows produce the same deposit. Similarly, lab experiments are very elegant. You can identify particular controls and vary them, but there are scaling issues with lab experiments. And I think Sean's talk will illustrate one of those, which is erosion of the seabed. And that's important because it produces sediment that drives the flow and makes it go faster or slower. Similarly, how do you know whether you're going to produce a dense flow in the lab or dilute flow? How do you know if the real things in the ocean are dense or dilute? And similarly, with numerical modeling or theory, you have to again know whether it's dilute or dense, because the physics is quite different before you know what to do. So that kind of drove me to try and measure events in action. So paraphrasing, it's really for me to go out to the active flows and measure them, and then you can go back to the rocks, or indeed to the lab experiments or the numerical modeling or theory, and you can know kind of what to do. I think there are exciting possibilities for seeing it in that kind of reverse way. So we've had a group of people who've been involved in measuring sediment flows, turbidity currents in action in shallow water settings worldwide. There's a quote at the top from the year 2000. It's thought this was impractical. As you'll see, there are indeed difficulties in measuring turbidity currents in action, but you can do it. But in recent years, we've shown it's possible. You can do this. You can do it with a single research grant. There are various papers listed here about the frequency of flows. See Mike Clare's talk later on there, how they're triggered, including by very dilute rivers. The sorts of structure they have on the right there from Maria's paper from the Congo, from a single mooring. Ed Pope has a paper that updates that. Matthew Cartini's led that work as well. And then there's also work on how the flows evolve. So there's a map of Monterey Bay at the bottom. Charlie Paul and others have worked with us on a project there showing how flows evolve. So at least in shallow water with the smaller scale flows, we can indeed measure them in action. We can show how they work directly. So next slide, please. So this is a quote actually from a review that we had from one of the Monterey papers, and it's making the point that you can measure the small scale events, but not the really important ones, the ones that really make the geological deposits that flush submarine canyons, not the ones that infill canyons, but the ones that flush them. They may have frequencies that are relatively infrequent, maybe a few hundred years, therefore in a 3-year science project, how do you measure them? So this actually will be the story of canyon flushing turbidity currents, and that will continue in the second and the third presentation. We were lucky, if you like. Next slide, please. So this slide just gives an overview of the project that myself and then Meg and then Sean will talk about. It's working on the Congo Canyon, which extends all the way from the mouth of the Congo River, second biggest river on the planet. The mouth of the submarine canyon extends into the river mouth itself, into its estuary. We placed a series of oceanographic moorings, a picture on the bottom right, which have an anchor, a chain, and then a float at the top. And in the float, there's a device called an ADCP, which can look down into the flow using acoustic sound. Meg will talk about some ocean bottom seismometers, and then we also repeat surveyed parts of the system, which Sean will talk about. Some of the moorings were put in the upper canyon, where number B is at the top there, and then we also put some moorings right out into deep water. It's the first time we've really gone after the big turbidity currents all the way to 5 kilometers water depth in the deep sea. Next slide, please. As a backstory, we put the moorings out at the September to October 2019. A couple of the moorings surfaced when they were hit by flows and the anchor chain broke through until December. And then on the 14th, the 16th of January in 2020, the rest of the moorings broke. They broke in sequence from shallow water to deep water. The two cables, telecommunication cables to West Africa also broke that crossed the canyon. And this was a huge flow because those submarine cables are not broken for the previous 18 years. And this wasn't trivial, so it caused the internet to slow all the way from Nigeria to Cape Town. For us, we had the problem of getting the moorings back. They come to the surface and email their position. And then we had the challenge of actually getting something the size of a football from something the size of an ocean, which we successfully did. We got 9 of the 11 back. I'd like to thank all of the people involved in doing that. I never thought we'd get most of them back. Next slide, please. So what happened? This is a plot. So along the top is September, October, November, December 2019, and then January 2020. The vertical axis is the distance from the Congo River-mouth from 0 to 1,200 kilometers. The red lines are the turbidity currents that run out into deeper water. The horizontal lines are our moorings or the cables. So through October, November, December, there's small flows that infill the upper canyon. 3 of the moorings broke. And then at the far right-hand side is this huge event in January the 14th to the 16th, 2020, that broke everything else and caused it to surface. Next slide, please. So, so the 2 things I'm going to address here, they're really about arrival times of the events that we measured. Meg will talk about other things, as will Sean. But the arrival times can help you understand what triggers these events. So this is a plot of the discharge of the Congo River. Importantly, the Congo River had a 1 in 50-year flood that peaked in late December 2019, actually. And our first big flow that broke all the moorings was 3 weeks later. And that was a 1 in 50-year flood. So the cables, the seafloor cables, had not broken for 18 years previously, but just after the 1 in 50-year flood, they broke January the 14th. They broke again on March the 9th, 2020. There was then a 1 in 20-year flood of the Congo River the next year. And the cables broke again on the 28th of April that year. And then they broke a few months ago in January 2022. So there's an association between these really long run out canyon flushing flows and large river floods, a 1 in 50-year or 1 in 20-year flood. But as you'll notice, the red arrows are the turbidity currents in the time series here. They don't coincide with the flood peaks. In fact, they can be weeks to months later. So the flood seems to bring a lot of sediment into the river mouth. It primes it like a capacitor, but then it waits for weeks or months before it finally spits out one of these huge turbidity currents. Next slide, please. So if you can see at the bottom, there's a plot of tidal cycles there. And not in every case, but in most cases, the final trigger appears to be a spring tide, particularly for the March the 9th and April 28th flows, possibly even the January 14th, the first one. They occurred at spring tides. So in terms of the triggering mechanism, we can rule out hyperpycnal flows. So river floods do indeed connect into the deep sea. Produce these huge flows, but not via hyperpycnal plunging at the river mouth. If so, they would coincide with the flood peaks, and they don't. And it's we don't have data from the river mouth as yet. It's some combination of priming by the floods and then final triggering at spring tides actually causes the flows. So next slide, please. So that was the kind of triggering story. The rivers prime it, and then the spring tides cause the big flows to go 1,000 kilometers. The second kind of topic I'll touch on is how do turbidity currents behave? This is a plot of the frontal speed, the transit speed between moorings or cables in the vertical axis up to 9 meters per second against distance from the Congo River mouth from 0 to 1,200 kilometers. The black line at the top there is the January 14th event. You'll see that it gradually built in speed. In the upper canyon, it was about 5 meters per second. It broke the cables in the mid canyon and then ramped up its speed up to 8 meters per second. So this is the first large-scale, field-scale demonstration that turbidity currents can indeed ignite or self-accelerate. And as Sean will show, this is linked to erosion of the seabed, and things like seabed gradient or the width or the depth of the canyon can't produce this. For instance, gradient decreases with distance, yet this flow speeded up. The other lines on there are other events, and you'll notice that there's a kind of grey bar that I've put across there, and turbidity currents that have transit speeds above that, above about 5 meters per second, grow and get bigger, whereas flows that are only a little bit slower in terms of transit speeds in the upper canyon die out. So there's kind of this knife edge between ignition and flows that dissipate. Next slide, please. So this is really an advert for Sean's talk, the next but one, where he'll show the seabed erosion. But as summary, it was huge. So at least a best estimate of 2.7 cubic kilometers of erosion occurred. For comparison, that's between 19 and 37% of the global annual suspended sediment flux from every river on the planet. It went down just one submarine canyon, probably in about 2 events. And even our minimum estimate is about 1 cubic kilometer. So this is more sediment that was produced from the Kaikoura earthquake triggered turbidity current or the big event off Japan after the magnitude 9. It's a very large amount of sediment. Next slide, please. So how do flows behave? On the left is a kind of compilation of other places worldwide where we have these plots of frontal speed against distance. I put a sort of summary version of the data from Congo in there, and there are 3 things that really come out. The first one is there's a consistent initial threshold speed for a flow to ignite of about 5 meters per second. And that's the same whether it's a very, very muddy system like the Congo or indeed a very, very sandy system like Monterey Canyon. Grain size doesn't seem to affect what that critical threshold initial speed is for ignition, and that's contrary to theory. It makes me wonder about things like a denser model for what the front of the flow that drives them is like. A second thing that Meg will actually show in greater detail with better information is that, okay, there's ignition in the January flow, but there are rather small changes in flow front speed from 5 to 8 meters per second over a very long distance, over 1,000 kilometers. And other events on the left here can sustain about the same speed in Monterey Canyon for 30 kilometers, in the Gaoping Canyon off Taiwan for 100 kilometers, or indeed in the fjords in Canada for a few tens of kilometers. So the fronts of the flow at least seem to approach some sort of equilibrium state, auto-suspending if you like, yet at least in Congo they eroded a huge amount of sediment that you associate with ignition, and the 2 are not mutually exclusive. And the other thing is the front speed may need to exceed this threshold, but it can be quite similar at about 7 meters per second in Monterey, and the flow will go for 50 kilometers, or about 7 or 8 meters per second in the Congo and go for 1,000 kilometers. So similar front speeds produce flows that run out for very different distances and indeed erode to extremely different degrees. So similar fronts can have very different bodies. So here are 3 key conclusions about how flows work, about how they behave, as well as how they're triggered. And you'll hear more about this in the next couple of talks. So to conclude, there are 2 main kind of scientific messages from this, apart from we can actually measure flows in action, and indeed sometimes we can measure the really big ones in action. The first one is that river floods and spring tides combine to trigger these big flushing events, not just earthquakes. So in this case, the river flood primes the river mouth with sediment. It quivers on the verge of going for weeks or months or possibly even years, and then a rather small trigger, often a spring tide, can cause it to spit out one of these flows that runs out to the deep sea. So that's kind of the triggering side. And then on the flow behavior side, the flows can indeed ignite. So ignition can occur. There's a kind of consistent initial front speed above which flows seem to need to get to ignite, and that doesn't depend on grain size. The flow fronts keep about the same speed for very long distances, some approach of almost equilibrium, despite eroding cubic kilometers in the case of the Congo seabed sediment. And then finally, flows with very similar front speeds and probably front states can run out for a few tens of kilometers or 1,200 kilometers. So flows with similar fronts have different bodies. So hopefully that's a kind of overview of the project, and Meg and Sean will now go into more detail, and I think more exciting detail about 2 other parts of the project. So I'll leave that there. Hopefully that worked through.
It worked very well. Thank you very much for this
Cool.
a fantastic overview and for regrouping so well after the difficult start. So I would like to invite the audience to type questions in the question box and do hit send once you have typed it. So awaiting those questions, if I may ask the first question, Piet, you show a fascinating overview of this quite similar velocity that seems to be kind of an ignition threshold, perhaps. What about the other key variables in the currents? Are they also the same? So I'm thinking about flow thickness and the sediment concentration or the density.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the other parameters that are involved, seabed gradient decreases with distance for the Congo, so that can't drive anything to go faster. In fact, it can't really drive things to keep the same speed. The width of the thalweg in both the canyon and the channel is about the same. It doesn't change hugely. That can't explain it. In the deeper water part, the channel is less deep. It's no longer a canyon, so you can overspill sediment out from the channel. So that should favor dissipation, yet this flow accelerated. So none of those container-shaped variables can explain it. We know from Sean's talk, as you'll see in a minute, that it eroded a really huge amount of sediment, about as much as 1/3 of the annual supply from every river in the world. It seems that the front of the flow is the key, as I think Meg will show in much better detail, that drives the whole event. It's eroding material as it goes, reaching some near equilibrium state as well as it transfers material backwards. And I guess Meg's talk will probably answer this in more detail than I can, so I don't want to steal that thunder. I'm really the advert for that talk, I think.
That's fascinating. So you did mention briefly that the models that quantify ignition seem to break down. If I understood correctly, that the theory isn't predicting this correctly. So have you tested parameterizing some of the layer averaged models, for instance, to see which of the terms are particularly troublesome in predicting this ignition point, or have you not gone so far?
I guess the field observation is that in your sandiest possible system, which is Monterey Canyon, and in an extremely muddy system that's Congo Canyon, it's still about 5 meters per second before they ignite. So the settling velocity of the average grain size is probably not the key control.
Right.
Personally, I think the front of the flow is more debris flow-like, or certainly dense enough. And a debris flow doesn't particularly care about the settling velocity of an individual grain size, it cares about pore fluid pressure and the sorts of things that Richard Everson has talked about. Yeah. So that's one way in which that theory could break down. So
especially entrainment terms that depend on settling velocity and things like that might be up for rethinking. That's really fascinating. So I'm talking, and I'm happy to talk for an hour longer, but are there any questions or chat remarks coming in from the audience? I don't see any.
If you want, just to add, in the numerical modeling, you can make a flow do anything you want it to do, depending on how it erodes or deposits. As Sean will show, the way in which this flow or these flows eroded is very specific. And unless you capture how that erosional process works, because the sediment in the flow then drives it, and how you move sediment from the front to the back, it won't be about just a single settling velocity or a layer averaged equation. It's about your bottom boundary condition.
Okay, that's very interesting. So another question, perhaps more broadly, that is very specific for the modeling. So let's forget about modeling problems, because you were not addressing those in your presentation. So for the monitoring of natural systems, we've seen quite a lot of exciting work coming from your team and teams surrounding you in this community. What do you think is the next big step forwards? Perhaps also thinking to explaining deposits and deposit characteristics and geological record, perhaps.
So I guess in places you can go back and you can core the deposits from a flow that you've actually measured, the thing I could never do at an outcrop. And I think Meg is actually working on that in a different part of the project, and Sophie Haag and others have done that at Squamish with Gwyn and John Hughes Clark's help. So you can go back to deposits having cored them next to the flow that you actually measured in action, so you know what it did. I think Meg is actually just about to show what I think the future of monitoring is, and our problem is that we put moorings with anchors, and the anchor has to go inside the flow. And if the mooring gets powerful enough, well, even when it's not that powerful, the mooring can tilt over, and that makes it tricky for your measurements, but it might break the mooring. We have to go chasing them across the ocean, as we did in January, March, during the COVID lockdown, to get all of the stuff back. So Meg is about to show what I think the future might be, and how you might remotely sense these flows.
Very, very exciting. So there's a question coming in from the audience by Gladys Gaillot. And the question is, were you able to measure the flow in the terminal lobe site where it was dying away? What happened there? So were you able to trace the flow dynamic all the way to the terminal position in the system?
A very good question. So we had 11 moorings. We didn't have permits for the middle bit of the Congo, so as Gladys will know, it's trickier there. So we put the last of our moorings at the end of the channel. So the short answer is no. We had to choose sites. We took a risk by putting stuff down the far end because it might not have ever reached it. And I put a lot of stuff at the far end thinking it was going to be safer because it's further away, whereas this flow grew in speed, so actually it was a worse place. But the short answer is no, not yet. If we go back and we can put enough moorings out, then we could do that. The time-lapse survey of that lobe is going to be fascinating, I think. There may even be resolvable differences. We have an ROV there in the next cruise, hopefully.
Fantastic. We do have a few more minutes if there are other questions from the audience. So a question coming in from Patricia Buffon. Thank you for your presentation, Peter. Very impressive turbidity currents. Would concentration also play a role in the velocity threshold for ignition? So do you think concentration is a key player in ignition?
Yeah, I guess the concentration will produce the driving forces, which will drive the flow down slope. So it'll obviously a key parameter. I think for these flows, which all seem to be igniting at about the same threshold velocity, which is independent on grain size, I think the concentration is saturated. I think it can't keep increasing. And there's various other evidence. Charlie Paul has a paper from Monterey Canyon where an 800 kilogram object was rafted down the canyon at the same speed as some small basketball shaped objects. They just moved in lockstep. I think they were rafted. So I think they were in something that was pretty dense, something we might term a debris flow or a liquefied flow. And that once it gets to those concentrations, it maybe saturates. And that's why the flow speeds as you go with distance don't actually change hugely. They've saturated at about the most that they can do. And as Sean will show, they're eroding over 30 meters of sediment from the seabed. So there's a lot of sediment coming into the bottom of the flow, to put it mildly.
Yeah. Okay. So another question coming in from Abdul Wahab. And he asks about the steadiness of the flows. Basically, his question is how much does the flow speed drop from the frontal part to the body of the current? Do we know this?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So Meg will also show that in more detail. The seismometers picked up the interior of the flow. I was just talking about front speeds, but what we've seen in the upper canyon is that there's a hotspot of fast-moving fluid and sediment, denser part of the flow at the front. And then there's a trailing body that's just being left behind. It's that frontal hotspot of fast and probably dense flow, which is really driving the whole event. So we'd already measured that with ADCPs for the small events in the upper canyon. And I think Meg will show how we may have measured that actually for much bigger events as they ripped through the entire canyon. But there's a hot spot of denser and faster stuff at the front that leaves behind a dilute cloud. And for the dynamics of the event, I'm not sure the dilute cloud really matters very much, although it's easier to model. I think it's the interaction of that dense frontal layer. In our small events, it's half an hour long. In Meg's events, it's about 14 hours long, 350 kilometers from front to back. But it's all about that frontal, fast and dense bit.
Okay, so frontal can also mean 14 hours, which is quite a prolonged phase of high flow velocity, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I guess if you've got to erode 1/3 of the fluvial sediment supply from every river in the world, you've got to kind of work on it a bit.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, final question before we switch over, I guess, by Georges Postma. And his question is, at the point of acceleration, is there evidence for large erosional structures, such as giant flutes or some other features in the seafloor that we can recognize?
Sean will show those images. So we've got time-lapse surveys before and after in 2019 and 2020, and the change is so huge you can pick it up from a shipborne system. So I think Sean will show probably what the answer is there.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you very much, Peter, for taking the time and the effort to present this from your remote location at the moment. And I'm glad we managed the technical issues.